Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kirk Cousins. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 17 tight end and quarterback rankings for the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, before we get into today's content in terms of talking about matchups at the tight end and quarterback position, in specific, the defenses that have been giving up the most points to opposing tight ends and quarterbacks since Week 10, in order to give ourselves more perspective as to the most advantageous matchups going into the week, then transitioning into talking about our top 16 quarterback and tight end rankings, as I'll share with you guys my opinions and the statistics that justify the reasons as to why I have it ranked as such. Before we get into all of that, a reminder for those of you who have not yet already on one of my prior videos this week, be sure to go down to the comment section and let me know what your roster is. Whether you're commenting just immediately as a reply to my pinned comment or your own individualized comment, be sure to go ahead and let me know what your roster consists of going into Week 17. I'm going ahead and collecting data in order to find correlations in regards to specific prospects who have helped us get to our 2022 Fantasy Championship week. So I'll go ahead and present those statistics on Sunday morning, again, like we typically do every week. Sunday morning live stream from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'll have that information along with updated rankings on screen available to you guys for those of you who have questions and or starter decisions to make by Sunday morning. It'll be a new year, and hopefully we'll start off the new year right by winning a 2022 Fantasy Football Championship for you guys. Now, speaking of live streams, later tonight after the Thursday Night Football game, I typically do have a live stream. This week we will not be having one. I will be going ahead and having a Saturday live stream from 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Again, there's a lot of information that is yet to come out, and answering questions at this current capacity would be a little bit premature in my eyes. So we're going to go ahead, of course, have our Saturday live stream along with our Sunday morning live stream, have all of the accurate and available information demonstrated to you guys so that we are all on the same page and accurately putting together lineups that'll help us win in this given week. Now, outside of that, speaking of the Thursday Night Football game, for those of you who want to continue to play daily fantasy at your fingertips, be sure to check out PrizePicks. You can go ahead, travel to their website with the link down in the description of the video. Again, while you're down in the description, whether you're looking at timestamps, clicking the like button, and or commenting down below, be sure to click on that link, travel to PrizePicks, check them out, and if in fact you're interested in picking more or less on given player statistics, whether it's the NFL for Thursday night game, whether it's the NBA, NHL, all of the above, go ahead, use promo code Andrew today. When you make that first time deposit, your first time deposit will immediately be doubled up to $100. You can take advantage of that today. And of course, not only play PrizePicks for this upcoming Thursday, but going into the NFL playoffs, when there's no more fantasy football, you'll have another way to play daily fantasy. So check that out today. Use promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 17 tight ends, beginning with matchups. As you can see to the right of me, we've gone ahead and collected data in terms of receiving statistics alone in regards to tight ends since Week 10 and how many fantasy points they've been allowed from these respective defenses, finding that the Jacksonville Jaguars, Dolphins, Broncos, Titans, Giants, Jets, they are the worst defenses. They're giving up the most fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Again, meeting everyone in the middle, whether you do play in a standard league or a full PPR league, giving up the most fantasy points to those prospects on a per weekly basis. Now, with all that information taken into account, in some of these circumstances, we won't be able to take advantage of the matchups because are we truly going to play a Houston Texans tight end? Even though Jordan Akins has played well at times this season, but the fact of the matter is starting a Houston Texans tight end in Week 17 is relatively risky. Now, when we talk about the Miami Dolphins, both of the New England Patriots tight ends, Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry, got injured last week. Are they both going to be inactive? Are they both going to somehow, fire through it and still end up playing? They could end up having value in said contest, but again, they haven't played well all year. There hasn't been much of a contribution of opportunity towards the tight end position within that offense based on the offensive coordinator change to the Denver Broncos. It's a fantastic matchup. Of course, Travis Kelce has an advantage this week. Not only did Tyler Higbee tear them apart last week, but he should be able to dominate this week. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, in terms of some of the teams that have really stopped the opposing tight end position, the Colts, the Bills, the Eagles, the Cowboys, the Saints, this really gives you guys an indication as to which of these tight ends we might want to avoid and or take advantage of in specifically playing. Now, with all this information presented to you guys, we'll then transition into talking about our top 16 tight end rankings. You want to start your studs. And the fact of the matter is, our number one is always a stud every single week. Regardless of whether or not he plays well, you have to have him in your lineup. But luckily, he's on a 2-game streak of 100-plus receiving yards. And hopefully we can turn that into a 3-game streak because this upcoming week, like I mentioned prior, he does play against the Denver Broncos. Most recently, they gave up 12 receptions, 151 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns to Los Angeles Rams tight ends in Week 16. Now, if that wasn't enough, you go back a couple weeks back to Week 14. Travis Kelce had an opportunity of taking on this defense, and Kansas City tight ends combined for 7 receptions, 116 receiving yards. I'm hoping for Travis Kelce to get more utilization within this offense, and of course, with more opportunity comes more fantasy points, and obviously a great week. Moving on, let's talk about George Kittle, one of these players that has been playing out of his mind over the course of the last 2 weeks. His last 2 performances, one consisting of 4 catches, 93 and 2 touchdowns. The other, this past week against the Washington Commanders, 6 catches, 122 touchdowns, 23.3 and 27.0 fantasy points. Now, in the last 2 weeks, he has combined for 213 receiving yards. 109 of those receiving yards are after the catch. As long as you continue to get Kittle over the middle, get the ball in his hands, he is going to make defenders miss. He is one of the fastest tight ends in the National Football League, and that is certainly obvious based on his overall contribution and production over the last couple weeks. The only other thing that I wanted to mention, besides the fact that taking on the Las Vegas Raiders is a very advantageous matchup, that team is falling apart, and obviously not starting Derek Carr, so it's certainly going to be tough for them to move the ball. It will give more opportunities to the San Francisco 49ers, but there was an opportunity last week against the Washington Commanders for George Kittle to have his third touchdown. He was tackled short on the 1-yard line, eventually turned into a Christian McCaffrey rushing touchdown. Nonetheless, there's a lot of potential here for George Kittle. Moving on. Evan Ingram's our number 3. Evan Engram, since week 13, the last 4 games, 11.5, 33.7, 10.2, 14.8, continues to put together incredible weeks. 3 touchdowns in the last 4 games, 2 games of over 100 receiving yards. This last week against the New York Jets, 8 targets, 7 receptions, 113 receiving yards, is continuing to dig into the work of Christian Kirk because he is primarily lining up in the slot position. And with those overall contributions going in his direction and the matchup on hand going up against the Houston Texans, let's not forget, earlier this season, when the Houston Texans beat the Jacksonville Jaguars, we still saw an incredible game from Evan Engram. In that contest, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 69 receiving yards. If he's able to get himself 9.9 fantasy points again, of course, he will certainly be a tight end 1 prospect within the week. But based on his overall production over the course of last month, he'll probably get even more opportunity and maybe a touchdown upside there. Moving on to TJ Hockenson, our number 4. Speaking of touchdown upside, a guy that's coming off of another great week this season. 16 targets, 13 receptions, 109 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. For those of you who have TJ Hockenson, you're in the fantasy championship because of his 29.4 point performance. Incredible numbers. Since he has become a member of the Minnesota Vikings, from weeks 9 through 16 in the last 8 games, he's averaging 9 targets per game and 11.05 fantasy points per game. In the last 2 games against the Green Bay Packers in specific, who he'll be playing up against this week, when he was with the Detroit Lions, he always found success against that organization. Most recently, 16.6 fantasy points, 13.3. Both those games with over 6 receptions and a receiving touchdown. I'm hoping for TJ Hockenson to have another big week against the division rival. Moving on to our thumbnail for today's episode, we have Tyler Higbee. Tyler Higbee, over the course of the last 2 weeks with Baker Mayfield, has been the number 1 receiving prospect of the Los Angeles Rams. It is apparent by his overall utilization and, of course, the target opportunity. He has had 16 targets in the last 2 games. The next highest within the Los Angeles Rams organization is Van Jefferson with 7 and Tutu Atwell with 6 total targets. So obviously, we know that Baker's number 1 is going to continue to be Tyler Higbee. And even though the Los Angeles Chargers will attempt to try to stop him, it's going to be very difficult. Coming off of a week in which he had 9 receptions on 11 targets, 94 receiving yards, 2 receiving touchdowns. We have seen this Tyler Higbee in the past, but this has been very seldom over the course of the last couple years, especially with Matthew Stafford, to get to this level. Luckily for those of us who have Tyler Higbee, Baker Mayfield is still trying to fight for a job. This offense wants to continue to prove themselves every single week. They're going to come out and compete. The fact of the matter is, taking on the Los Angeles Chargers, it is an advantageous matchup. Should be a great play. Moving on, Dawson Knox is our number 6. Dawson Knox has been consistent, and that's why he continues to be in this conversation of being a must-start at the tight end position. Over the course of the last 3 games, 4 catches, 41 and a touchdown. 6 catches, 98 and a touchdown. This last recent week, 3 catches, 38 and a touchdown. 12.1, 18.8, 11.3 half PPR fantasy points. 10 plus points. And even though we have seen the absence and or the lack of utilization from a guy like Stephon Diggs, even if Stephon Diggs is going to get himself more utilization and more work going forward, I don't believe that Dawson Knox's overall baseline of opportunity is going to diminish. I believe he's going to continue to be a consistent option, especially taking on the Cincinnati Bengals, who most recently gave up, 7 catches, 59 and a touchdown to David Njoku. 4 catches for 56 to Travis Kelce. That was a little bit of a rough game, but either way. Pat Freiermuth also had 8 catches for 79 against them. These are recent performances where we've seen tight ends torch this defense. Dawson Knox is next on hand. Moving on. Let's talk about Dalton Schultz, our number 7. Here's the fact of the matter. The Tennessee Titans defense is going to be playing tonight without 7 of their primary starters. Some defensive line, some secondary, some linebackers. With that all being taken into account, and the fact that the Tennessee Titans defense are giving up 11.41 half PPR fantasy points per week to opposing tight ends. And we've most recently seen Houston, 5 catches for 60 from tight ends. Los Angeles Chargers, 7 catches for 77. The Jacksonville Jaguars, of course, had the legendary performance of Evan Engram against them. Philadelphia 4 for 60. Cincinnati with 6 for 57. There have been great performances across the board. I'm expecting Dalton Schultz to be utilized, especially with the absence of Pollard. Other receiving options are going to have to step up within this offense. Moving on to Kmet, our number 8. He has one of the best matchups on the week, taking on the Detroit Lions. And the fact of the matter is, if you go back to week 10, the last time the Chicago Bears with Justin Fields took on the Detroit Lions, we saw Kmet have 4 catches, 74, and 2 receiving touchdowns, 21.4 half PPR fantasy points. Most recently, we have seen other tight ends obviously dominate against this defense. Guys like CJ Uzomah, 2 catches, 41, 2 touchdowns. TJ Hockenson, 6 for 77. Evan Engram, 5 catches, 30, and a touchdown. The Detroit Lions defense has been torched by opposing tight ends. Kmet is next on hand. Moving on, we have David Njoku as our number 9. David Njoku continues to be one of the primary receiving options within this offense down in the red zone. Like I talk about with Nick Chubb on a weekly basis, this offense has begun to, kind of lean in the direction of utilizing him less and less within the red zone, which gives more opportunities for David Njoku, Donovan Peoples-Jones, and of course, Amari Cooper. Specifically, David Njoku, since we have seen the takeover of Deshaun Watson within this lineup, has garnered 38% of the red zone target share, which is a significant number. Taking on the Washington Commanders, who just gave up 6 catches for 120 and 2 touchdowns to a guy like George Kittle, there's a lot of potential for David Njoku to have himself a big performance here and get back on track. Obviously, coming off of a game in which the weather was definitely a concern and certainly a determining factor as to whether or not these receiving options were going to succeed, we'll certainly have a better overall experience going into the week in Washington. Moving on to Pat Freiermuth at number 10. Pat Freiermuth with Kenny Pickett from week 7 through 16. 7.43 targets per game, and 8.76 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. He did take on the Baltimore Ravens just a couple weeks ago in week 14, but majority of that game was played with Mitchell Trubisky at the quarterback position, considering Kenny Pickett was in the concussion protocol. That being said, Pat Freiermuth, if he's able to get himself his normal average of 7 to 8, 9 fantasy points, we're in a fantastic position. The fact that he came off of a week of 10.1 fantasy points, I mean, what more could we ask for? He's not going to be a touchdown upside player. That's why he sits at number 10. But if he's able to get his receptions, his yardage, he's a fantastic play. Moving on, we have Mark Andrews at number 11. I've kind of given up on the Mark Andrews train. From weeks 7 through 16, his most fantasy points contributed in a half PPR has been 9.3 in a singular week. Now, when you go ahead and isolate the Tyler Huntley games over the course of the last couple weeks, his best overall performance is 4 catches for 53 yards. Tyler Huntley is not really targeting him at the capacity in which he did last season. It is apparent that Mark Andrews has slowed down this year, and we have to treat him as such in comparison to the rest of the tight end field. Moving on to Dallas Goedert, or number 12. The primary reason why I have him here, if in fact Jalen Hurts does end up starting, I think Dallas Goedert's an automatic play, probably even moves up in my rankings just slightly ahead of Pat Freiermuth. But considering it is Gardner Minshew, and they're taking on the New Orleans Saints, which is one of the better defense in terms of stopping opposing tight ends over the course of the entire season, if not the last couple seasons, due to the efforts of one Demario Davis, one of the best coverage linebackers in the National Football League. There is a conversation that can be had in terms of Dallas Goedert and what his overall potential can be, especially if he doesn't find the end zone. Therefore, he sits at the back end of the tight end one conversation. Moving on to Juwan Johnson. Now, Juwan Johnson does have touchdown upside. We know that. In the last 7 games that he has played, he has scored 7 touchdowns. Now, this was all prior to the weather game in Cleveland. So I'm not even counting that game because, quite frankly, that wasn't really a actual game. You can't even take into account the fact that 2 targets, 1 reception, 9 yards. They were not heavily utilizing any sort of receiving options. They ran the ball for a majority of the game, whether it was via Alvin Kamara, David Johnson, and or Taysom Hill. Now, with that being said, he has taken on tougher performances in the past, taking on the San Francisco 49ers secondary, and even in that game a couple weeks back did end up dropping a touchdown. There have been multiple opportunities where Juwan Johnson continues to get himself more and more red zone upside. It's just a matter of whether or not he's able to come down with the ball. I think he'll certainly be able to be in the conversation this week. The likelihood is lower than usual considering the coverage of Kazir White, one of the better linebackers in terms of coverage in the National Football League for the Philadelphia Eagles. Moving on, we have Noah Fant at number 14. The primary reason why he sits here, back-to-back weeks of a receiving touchdown, Will Dissly is being placed on the injured reserve, and if in fact we see Tyler Lockett end up missing, I think Noah Fant's overall ranking can go up. He takes on the New York Jets most recently, 8 catches for 130 to Jacksonville tight ends. We saw Detroit, 4 catches, 67 and a touchdown. We saw Buffalo tight ends, 4 catches, 41 in the touchdown. Minnesota, 5 for 45. There's ample amount of opportunity that is going in the direction of tight ends when they're taking on the New York Jets, primarily because you can't really throw it to anybody else when Sauce Gardner and Michael Carter are really locking down wide receivers. Therefore, Noah Fant has value. Moving on, Greg Dulcich at number 15. In the last 3 weeks in which we have seen Greg Dulcich play with a starting Russell Wilson, he has been targeted 8 times per game. fantastic. His yardage counts in those 3 games, 85, 42, 39. I don't love those numbers. Luckily, he was able to score a touchdown this last week. That being said, it's still going to be a tough matchup going up against the Kansas City Chiefs. Therefore, he sits at 15. Moving on to the final prospect at tight end that I wanted to mention. Here's the thing. Darren Waller with a backup quarterback does not seem like something I'm excited about, nor do I feel obligated in terms of starting him because he is Darren Waller. That being said, I think there could be a conversation in regards to playing guys like Tyler Conklin and or Mike Gesicki, Taysom Hill ahead of Darren Waller this week, but we're going to have to keep an eye on it and see exactly what we want to do because, quite frankly, that matchup against the San Francisco 49ers frightens me and very easily could end up leading to Darren Waller having a poor performance, which certainly would help nobody in this given format unless you're playing up against Darren Waller. All right, with all that covered, let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about quarterbacks, beginning with matchups. As you can see to the right side of the screen, we have how many fantasy points have been allowed to opposing quarterbacks from these defenses since week 10. Of course, giving you guys a smaller spectrum of time to understand how well these defenses have played as of late. Of course, we have defenses like the Jacksonville Jaguars, Minnesota Vikings, Tennessee Titans, Miami Dolphins, Detroit Lions that can all be taken advantage of. But which of these quarterbacks do we truly want to play? Guys like Aaron Rodgers against Minnesota, that's great. Dak Prescott against Tennessee, fantastic. Justin Fields going up against the Detroit Lions, beautiful. We love those matchups. We'll take advantage of them. On the other end of the spectrum, we have the Washington Commanders, Falcons, Saints, Jets, Steelers that have shut down opposing quarterbacks over the course of the last 2 months here, 6 to 7 games. Overall, giving you guys this information in terms of passing statistics alone, not talking about rushing statistics allowed to opposing quarterbacks, because again, even though a defense may be more prone to giving up yardage to a guy like Justin Fields on the ground, this doesn't entirely mean that someone like Tom Brady will be able to take advantage of those statistics. But when we're talking about passing statistics isolated, we have the numbers as such. Now, with this taken into account, let's transition into talking about our top 16 quarterback rankings, beginning with our number 1. We have Josh Allen. Of course, Josh Allen has to be number 1. He takes on the Cincinnati Bengals on Monday Night Football. Should be an exciting matchup. In the last 5 consecutive games, Josh Allen has scored 2 or more touchdowns. In those 5 games, his rushing yard totals, 41, 77, 47, 20, and 78. With those high yardage counts, it's pretty much an additional touchdown added to his scoreline every single week. He's one of the highest upside quarterbacks in the National Football League, and like I've mentioned in the past, he's a cheat code. Now, the fact of the matter is, in the last 3 weeks, Stefon Diggs has seen very little opportunity and production. If you get more utilization in the direction of Stefon Diggs and he has himself one of his better games of the season, we could see even more upside with a guy like Josh Allen, who honestly is already scoring enough. For those of you playing up against him, you're probably hoping you get like the base minimum of 20 points and can relax after you put something like that up. But we won't know until Monday night, so good luck. Moving on, Joe Burrow. Speaking of Monday night, I think this is going to be one of the highest scoring games of the week. It's going to be a matter of whether the weather obviously kind of impacts the overall potential of this game. But the reason why I have Joe Burrow in this conversation is because in 3 out of his last 4 games that he has played, 3 or more touchdowns. Not only that, but most recently, the reason why we've seen more and more touchdowns go in the direction of Joe Burrow primarily has to do with the fact that he's getting more rushing work, more rushing upside down in the red zone, and we have seen less rushing potential from guys like Joe Mixon and Samaje Perine, in the last couple of weeks. Since Joe Mixon had that game against the Carolina Panthers where he had 4 rushing touchdowns, the backfield of the Cincinnati Bengals has only had 2 rushing touchdowns since then. It's been quite some time. So if we continue to get into a conversation where when we're getting down into the red zone, Joe Burrow continues to look in the direction of guys like T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, Tyler Boyd, etc., I'm expecting a lot more potential for Joe Burrow and his upside within a given week. Moving on to Dak Prescott, taking on the Tennessee Titans that, like I've mentioned multiple times on today's episode, will be missing 7 starters. Let me go ahead and just read off a bunch of names. Some of these guys aren't technically starters, but these are the last names of the players that are going to be missing. Fulton, Autry, Simmons, Thompson, Hooker, Dupree, Cunningham, Cole. That's 8 names, 7 starters that are going to be missing from that defense. I mean, Dak Prescott has played well. Even though he has thrown 11 interceptions in the last 8 games that he has played, he's also thrown 20 touchdowns in those last 8 games. 5 of those last 8 games, 3 or more total touchdowns scored. I'm expecting another 3 touchdown game this week and a fantastic performance for our fantasy squads, hopefully leading to a championship. Moving on to Patrick Mahomes, our number 4. He takes on the Denver Broncos. Again, it's an advantageous matchup. It should be, especially considering the fact that Baker Mayfield and that entire Los Angeles Rams team dominating that matchup. That being said, Patrick Mahomes, the last time he took on the Denver Broncos, week 14, 352 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, but unfortunately, 3 interceptions as well. If we're going to be in that conversation of Patrick Mahomes throwing interceptions, that could be a little bit of a rough overall sledding within the week. And there's always the conversation of it becoming a Jerick McKinnon plus Isaiah Pacheco day, where those running backs are just running through the defense. I'm hoping we're going to see another great performance here, 300 plus yards, 3 passing touchdowns with even more utilization on the ground. but it's tough to say, especially considering the Denver Broncos are a broken team and they could be very easily taken advantage of. We just got to hope that they keep it close so that Patrick Mahomes continues to have to throw in the second half. Moving on, let's talk about Justin Fields at number 5. Justin Fields was extremely underwhelming last week. Even though their team came out and within the first drive had a 64-yard drive that led to a passing touchdown from Justin Fields, for the rest of the game, their offense was nullified. They did not do a single thing besides score a field goal for the remainder of that game. So it certainly was unfortunate to see that occur, but I believe that weather was certainly a factor within that overall, performance within Justin Fields, especially the fact that he had 7 rushing attempts for 11 yards. The Bills certainly did stop him. That being said, he does take on the Detroit Lions. The last time he took on the Detroit Lions, he scored 39.38 fantasy points. He had 147 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, along with 167 passing yards and 2 passing touchdowns. Both those passing touchdowns going to Cole Kmet, which we previously mentioned on today's episode. That being said as well, rushing quarterbacks up against the Detroit Lions this year have found a lot of success. Not only, of course, did Justin Fields run for 147 and 2 touchdowns, but most recently, Josh Allen, 78 and a touchdown. Daniel Jones, 50 and a touchdown. Aaron Rodgers had 40 rushing yards. Geno Smith, 49 and a touchdown. Jalen Hurts, 90 and a touchdown. I'm expecting Justin Fields, at very base minimum, to be the number 5 quarterback on the given week. Moving on to Jared Goff. On the other end of this matchup, again, this is going to be a higher scoring event between these two teams. And hopefully Jared Goff's going to continue his momentum from the last couple weeks. Again, from weeks 12 through 16, he has put up a base minimum of 240 plus passing yards and has scored 11 total touchdowns in the last 5 games. Now, considering it's an indoor game in Detroit, there's no weather concern. This is going to be a high-powered offense taking on a defense that, in my mind, has been dealing with a lot of injuries, has lost a lot of their key players in this given year. Detroit has been giving up a lot of points to opposing quarterbacks. Therefore, Jared Goff should be in a perfect position to succeed, especially with their running game stalling out at times, especially down in the red zone. Leads to more passing attempts for Jared Goff. 3 passing touchdowns last week, all to one singular target. Hopefully, he spreads it out a little bit more in the given week. Moving on to Kirk Cousins, our number 7. Kirk Cousins in the last 2 games against the Green Bay Packers, which he will be taking on this week, put up 277 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 341 and 3 touchdowns. Now, those games contributed 19.08 and 25.24 fantasy points in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. The fact of the matter is, the Minnesota Vikings play a lot of one-score football games. Therefore, it leads to a lot of statistics for this offense to have to garner in order to stay within the matchup and, of course, compete with their opponents, considering how bad the Minnesota Vikings defense has been this season. Luckily, Justin Jefferson cooks this secondary. This is going to be a fantastic play for Kirk Cousins in the given week. Should have himself another big game here. Moving on, Trevor Lawrence at number 8. Trevor Lawrence takes on the Houston Texans. Earlier this season, when he took on this defense, he literally put up 10.34 fantasy points. A very underwhelming performance in which they lost 6-13. They got, completely brutalized, but that was a completely different Jacksonville Jaguars team. Let's just put this in perspective. Since the bye week, this is a 4-1 football team, and they've played extremely well in the last 5 games that they've put together. In fact, in those last 5 games, Trevor Lawrence has scored 13 total touchdowns through the air, on the ground, doesn't matter. It's combined 13 total. I expect to see a lot of production out of the direction of Trevor Lawrence, especially up against this Houston Texans team, which is preventing them from trying to get to the playoffs. With more motivation, leads to potential more fantasy points for the Jacksonville Jaguars. Moving on, Gardner Minshew is our number 9. We did get a little bit of information earlier today in regards to the potential of Jalen Hurts returning. He did end up practicing a little bit, throwing the ball. That does lead to us potentially expecting maybe the return of Jalen Hurts, but if in fact they want to be more cautious with his overall return, and we see Gardner Minshew as the starting potential quarterback within the given week, because if Jalen Hurts is starting, he is a top 3 quarterback. So you're starting him if he's available. But in the case of Jalen Hurts potentially not playing, you got to remember, in 11 of the last 13 games that Gardner Minshew has been a starting quarterback, he has scored 2 or more touchdowns. In 4 of those last 11 games that he has played 3 or more touchdowns, the team that surrounds him, whether it's offensive line, running game, receivers, defense, they are all elite. Therefore, Gardner Minshew has that much more upside within the given week, even up against the New Orleans Saints. Moving on to Brock Purdy, our number 10. When we want to talk about consistency at the quarterback position, Brock Purdy demonstrates that. Over the course of the last 4 weeks, 14.3 in a game in which he came in to relieve Jimmy Garoppolo, who, of course, went to the injured reserve. 21.7 the following week, 16.48, and then 15.96 this last week. Again, 2 touchdowns minimum in each of the last 4 games. Has an opportunity of taking on the Las Vegas Raiders defense. Earlier this week when I mentioned Brock Purdy as a waiver wire pickup, because again, he's not rostered in too many leagues, which isn't really a surprise, but either way, when I mentioned earlier this week, I talked about the Las Vegas Raiders defense giving up the 6th most passing yards amongst all teams in the National Football League thus far. Now that was with Derek Carr on the other side of the ball. Imagine when this team has to punt for majority of the day and or potentially are turning over the ball with Jarrett Stidham at quarterback, it'll lead to more potential for Brock Purdy in this offense. Moving on, Justin Herbert's our number 11. We could have never really predicted the instability and inconsistency of what we have witnessed from Justin Herbert this season when we were talking about him this offseason. We were expecting Justin Herbert to be the best quarterback in the league, if not potentially dethrone Josh Allen from being the number one quarterback over the last couple of years, but that has not been the case. Unfortunately, Justin Herbert has been extremely unpredictable, and even though that being the case, I truly do believe he has to be started. Going up against the Los Angeles Rams, even though this team has already secured a playoff spot, if he's active and ready to go, he's got himself upside. And with that, he's my number 11. Moving on, let's talk about Aaron Rodgers. Now, speaking of inconsistency, Aaron Rodgers has been consistently bad. That's the fact. He hasn't been inconsistent. I mean, in comparison to last year, sure, you can make that argument. But at this current moment in time, Aaron Rodgers taking on the Minnesota Vikings, I think it's a very advantageous matchup. Again, it's one of the worst secondaries in the National Football League. If Christian Watson is healthy and active, we should see a lot of air raid from the Green Bay Packers offense. Despite the fact that we haven't seen a lot of that over the course of the season, it should be a primary factor in this game. Specifically, when you look back at Week 1's contest between the Aaron Rodgers-led Green Bay Packers and the Minnesota Vikings, that game had a couple factors. The first one was the Green Bay Packers not being able to stop Justin Jefferson, and the second one was the Minnesota Vikings pass rush being able to dominate the Green Bay Packers offensive line. Hopefully, those offensive line issues are no longer the case, and if they're not, Aaron Rodgers should have himself a pretty good game here. Moving on, we have Mike White as our number 13. Mike White, coming off of course, the rib injury that has made him miss the last 2 weeks, which has only solidified the fact that he should be starting over Zach Wilson. Look, he has a lot of weapons that surround him, whether it's Garrett Wilson, Corey Davis, Elijah Moore, Tyler Conklin, of course, his running backs in Michael Carter and Zonovan Knight. There are a lot of weapons within this offense. I'm expecting this team, who are still trying to make the playoffs, to come out and in Seattle, as a current favorite to win that game, come out and put together a great performance, even up against the defense that has themselves pretty good cornerbacks as a whole. They cannot stop the run, and that'll continue to lead to a lot of play action opportunity in the direction of Mike White, which gives him a lot of fantasy upside. Moving on, Daniel Jones is our number 14, who in my mind is coming off of one of his better games of the season. 30 for 42 passing, a 71.4% passing completion percentage, 334 passing yards against the Minnesota Vikings. Now he has to take on a matchup which is, I would say, a little bit more difficult, taking on the Indianapolis Colts, who have given up their fair share of points to opposing quarterbacks. But that being said, on Monday night, Justin Herbert had 5.5 fantasy points. It was certainly brutal to witness that level of production. That all being said, I think Daniel Jones, his rushing upside, should be able to put together a pretty good game of fantasy points within the given week, and at very least have himself like 15 fantasy points, which at this point at number 14 would be a great option. Moving on to Tom Brady, our number 15. Tom Brady, do we want to start him? No. Do we have to start him in some circumstances? Yes. Taking on the Carolina Panthers should be an easy matchup, especially with Carolina dealing with a lot of injuries in the secondary. As long as Tom Brady's throwing the ball 40, 50 times a game, he's going to have fantasy value. You just got to hope that he has 2 passing touchdowns instead of the normal 1, because if he's able to get himself 300 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, no matter how many interceptions he possibly throws, he'll be in a conversation of scoring 14, 15, 16 fantasy points in the given week. Moving on to the final option I wanted to mention, really number 16 is a revolving door for me. One second it'll be Russell Wilson, the next is Sam Darnold. Now I've kind of landed on Deshaun Watson going into the given week. Deshaun Watson taking on the Washington Commanders is probably the worst matchup you could possibly ask for. That being said, Deshaun Watson has demonstrated that he has upside not only with his arm but with his legs. And when you add that into the entire combination of variables and the potential of production at a higher level, the ability to sustain quarterback 1 production, I believe Deshaun Watson is certainly capable of doing so. Therefore, I sit him at number 16. That's going to cover for me today. Thank you everybody for watching. Those are my top 16 tight end and quarterback rankings going into week 17. Good luck on your matchups this weekend. Again, do not forget, I will not be live streaming later tonight, but if you want to continue to play daily fantasy at your fingertips, get more action within tonight's game, have more entertainment and fun within that regard, you can go ahead, put together some entries via PrizePicks. There's a link down in the description of the video. You can go ahead and check that out. Use promo code Andrew today, because when you use that promo code, your first deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. Not only that, I'll be back tomorrow with some content, Saturday live stream, Sunday morning live stream. Thank you everybody for watching. And again, do not forget to comment down below in the comment section, whether it's a reply to my pinned comment and or your own comment, doesn't matter. Be sure to let me know what your overall roster is, because I'm trying to collect that data and have that ready for you guys on Sunday morning. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, have a good one, and I'll see you. Peace.